Welcome to another episode of Talking Nerdy in the Bedroom with just me. Yep, Corey is sick, Mike had to work late, so I am recording this one myself. We weren't able to find a time to reschedule, and then we all had plans for the weekend, so yeah, just gonna do it myself. We are going to be talking about Evil Dead Rise, which is the latest installment of Sam Raimi's Evil Dead universe, although he's not the director in this movie. It is a fantastic look at horror again. Like, there's been some horror movies that have come out in the past that, like, obviously I did a Scream podcast not too long ago, and that's more of a slasher. But there's something about this type of horror movie that's always stuck with me. And obviously the first few movies of the Evil Dead, and yes, we're just jumping right into this for everybody listening. So for the first few Evil Dead movies, like the first one's supposed to be scary, and we did a podcast on Evil Dead before, supposed to be scary, but came off as campy, which then became almost the theme of Evil Dead. And they did the second Evil Dead, it also campy, but so much enjoyableness to it. Then they did the third one and went full campy, and it was even better, at least from my perspective. And then the TV show, that was just magnificent, and we probably would have gotten 5 or 6 seasons worth of that show if it was on a better network than Starz. But now we get the reimagining of the story, I guess, like more in the vein of horror. If you go back, was it 2013 is when they released the Sam Raimi reimagining version of Evil Dead, where it's almost like a full retelling of the story in a cabin, and it was not well received. It didn't make that much money for what they thought it was going to be. It wasn't that big of a return to the franchise. But this, on the other hand, has made, I'm pretty sure, a decent amount of money. More money than they probably were expecting. Well, I should say that they're probably always hoping to make money, but I don't know if they knew it was going to be as successful as it was. Like, the budget was roughly, God, what was it, like 25 million, maybe less, and they've already made like 145 million, so it's almost guaranteed there'll be a sequel. And within this movie, they definitely set up some stuff that could be a sequel, because technically the Deadites, even though they never call them Deadites in this, are still around at the end of the movie. But the first thing that we're going to talk about, we're going to pause from talking about Evil Dead, and actually talk about the way movies have a tendency to just either jump right into the movie or have a cold open, or whether they try to like combine the two where it's a cold open, but it literally goes right into the movie. So it's not necessarily a cold open where it then shifts completely. And this is one of them that it's a little bit of both, because technically the cold open of this is the end of the movie. But it's not one of those where it's the end of the movie and it's that climactic moment and then it cuts back 2 weeks later. It's literally the end of the movie, where you already had all these characters that got established during the main part of the movie, and then once that's all over and got settled, then there's this extra part that's the end of the movie, which is also the beginning, but it has one of the best title sequences there is. Like, it goes right into, you start in a cabin in the woods, so it kind of feels like the old Evil Dead, but then it goes more horror, more scary, more what the hell is going to happen. And then when the girl, the Deadite, ends up going in the water and then rises out of the water, and then you got this title screen behind her coming over the mountains that says Evil Dead Rise. Oh, it's such good cinematography and setup and everything. And it's a little bit disappointing that then from there you shift back 2 weeks, but I actually have no problem with it, knowing that that character in the very beginning really has nothing to do with the entire movie. This is about another family that's in a high-rise apartment, and it's all about them and their struggle with this evil entity. And then only after the movie ends and you think that they've killed all the Deadites, there's actually still a Deadite left, and it inhabits this lady, woman, and then she goes to a cabin in the woods. So like that part I'm more okay with, rather than them trying to pull like a cheap trick. It actually kind of reminds me a little bit, what was that movie called? Fallen? Was it Fallen? The Denzel Washington movie where at the very beginning you hear Denzel's voice saying, "This is a story about how I almost died." And then you have this big, long 2-hour story of this evil entity that can go in between people, and eventually goes into Denzel Washington, but he kills himself. And then it looks like he's going to kill this demon entity, and then it manages to go into a cat, and then the voiceover comes on again and goes, "I told you this was the time I almost died." And it's great. And this kind of felt a little bit like that, because you think that maybe they've killed all the Deadites by the end of the movie, or the evil spirit, and then there's one left, and now it's going to continue, and now they're at this cabin. So it was really well done. There was some controversy about this movie too, which I didn't even know about until after I saw it. I don't even think it's something that me, Mike, Corey, or anybody that saw it with us talked about, but there are some LGBTQ characters in the movie, even though it's not specifically called out. And I didn't feel like it was being forced down the throat. I just thought they were characters. There's some kids, there's older, there's an aunt, there's the mom, there's the neighbor, there's yada yada. So they were just people to me. So it was weird that some people thought like they were trying to shove like an agenda down their throat. I'm not that person that really cares about that stuff, but I do know that I've heard from a lot of people about other movies where it's just, they're jamming down their throat. They're just putting it in there because they think it's going to sell better, when usually it's kind of the opposite. Rather than it just being people and characters, because in the world that we live in today, there are people that are gay, there are people that are trans, there are people yada yada. So if they're going to be in a movie, okay, but there's other movies that they're not in, also okay, because that's kind of how it is in real life. You could walk into a department store and there's going to be people that are Caucasian, straight, lesbian, bi, African American, Asian, trans, whatever. You're just going to see a multitude of people, and that's kind of how a movie should be. Not every movie, unless that's the story of the movie, should be focused on that. And if you just have these characters, you can make them interesting without focusing solely on how they identify or what their sexual preference is. Like, that can be a part of their kind of like character or how you make them up, but you don't have to focus on it to make them an interesting character. And I actually cared about these characters. Like, it's not an easy thing to do when you're talking about a movie that 95% of it takes place in the apartment, and not just the whole apartment building, but mostly just the apartment of this single family parent that has mom and I think it's 3 kids. So, like, that's very hard to get you to care about people that then you start killing off. And almost everybody dies. Only the aunt and one of the kiddos lives. Everybody else dies. All the other siblings die. The neighbors die. The mom dies. Mom dies first. And it's just a really cool way to show everything within this, like, God, what do they call it in TV shows? Now this is why I wish Mike and Corey were here. They might know. It's like a sandbox episode. I think there's a name for it, and I can't think of it right off the top of my head. Which is why it's a good thing I have Google, because I was able to pause it real quick and learn that it's called a bottle episode. So this movie, so at the very beginning, you're at the cabin, which is actually the end. And then there's another scene where they're kind of in the parking garage, but the majority is in the actual apartment itself, or the hallway of the apartment. So it's like a bottle episode, but for a movie. And they pull that off very well, where even though you're not given these grand set pieces, it still works. It's still terrifying. It might even be more terrifying, because that's these people's homes. That's the place where you kind of feel the safest is at your own home, because even if you're renting, it's still, because you're renting it, you feel like it's yours, it's your space, it's what you want. So to then have this evil entity come into your own home, let alone that it's, possessed your mom to begin with, but come into your own home can feel even scarier. So it actually wasn't sure how I was going to feel about the premise of the movie with being in a high rise rather than out in the woods, because all the Evil Deads basically have taken place out in the woods, except for Evil Dead 3, which Army of Darkness, which obviously took place in the old times. So even though that one's a little bit different, like the whole point is that you're out in the cabin in the woods and then you read a book and then you get you awake the spiritual creatures that will possess. And so this to be in the home, I wasn't really sure how that was going to be, but they pulled it off. They did. We didn't have many moments in the movie theater that I remember of people like jumping or freaking out or anything like that. But we did have a couple like jump scare moments, but I don't think they were cheap jump scares. And then there was a couple parts, especially with the cheese grater, that were actually like, ooh, like groans in the audience, which is not, I'm pretty sure it's like back in like Saw 4 or 5 or something was the last time I heard like actual groans, not just one person groaning, but like the entire theater groaning over something they were seeing because it made them like a little bit squeamish. But yeah, just everything that this movie was able to put together felt like a return to horror that I haven't seen in a while. And I'm all about horror movies that have like a thrilling aspect where you kind of don't know what's going to happen, or if there's a way to divert your expectations, which if you guys ever have a chance, The Barbarian, it was on HBO. I'm not sure if it still is. Now their app is called Max. I'm not sure if it's still on there, but The Barbarian is fantastic, and it has this way of setting something up and then changing directions and then setting something up and changing directions while keeping like the intensity at an 11. And this movie, I wouldn't say it's at an 11, but they have this way of setting up expectations for some of these characters, especially if you're an Evil Dead fan, and somewhat subverting them. It kind of follows the same thing where you have a hero that comes through in the end, but that's most movies. Saving the little kid, I would kind of expect it, although they killed the other kids. That was, it's the only thing that made sense because there weren't that many people in this movie to begin with. Like, I think the cast is like 8 people. But I was surprised that they pulled the trigger on killing the kids rather than just saving all the kids and only killing the adults. But they did save the youngest, which is fine, but it also sets up the future ones. Like, is the main character in this one going to become, a Bruce Campbell Ash, where she then just keeps getting haunted by this deadite presence, and she keeps getting sucked back into having to do some gruesome things and having all these terrible things happen to her? Or was this kind of a one-off? Like I said, they've set up the fact that deadites are still out there, this evil presence is still out there, but it's also one of those, where do you go from here? Do you just tell a new story with the deadite still being out there? Do you tell a new story where somebody else reads from one of these books, which I'll come back to in a second, the Necronomicon, or do you do something completely different? Like, there's a lot of choices for them to do. I think the right choice is for them to continue the story with her and the boy, because he's probably going to be going through some trauma and PTSD and things like that, because it gets pretty graphic, especially towards the end. I mean, it's graphic throughout, but the amount of blood, which makes sense for an Evil Dead movie and this little kid, but he could be dealing with that, and then them finally maybe like overcoming it, or him sleeping at night, and then another thing happens, and now it's got to be him and his aunt again, kind of against these Evil Dead creatures. So that would be the way that I would like it to go, just because I like the idea of an Ash character. You're never going to recreate Ash, and I'm glad they didn't necessarily try. They did have some homages to the first few movies with the chainsaw and just certain stuff that they've done, but they didn't do anything. They didn't try to recreate the Ash charm and charisma and swagger that he had, which is good because it was kind of organic, and that's who Bruce Campbell was, and that's who he really leaned into in the future movies, and then obviously the TV show. they're trying to do something different with her, just obviously making her a badass, which I'm fine with. That's how you build new characters, franchises, and everything else. You can't just only rely on the stuff that's happened in the past and just try to recreate it. You got to do it organically, and it seems like they have a decent ability to do this with this girl. Whether that happens or not, again, with the amount of money it made, it's a huge success for this studio, because if they spent $25 million on the budget and let's say another $25 million on advertising, that's $50 million. So let's say that's what they did. If it's $50 million and it made $140 million, that's $90 million profit. Even if they spent an extra $20 or $50 million on advertising, it still made them quite a bit of money. So I see no reason for there not to be another movie, especially because this movie was very well received by both critics and audiences. I say that now, but that was the last time I heard. Obviously, things could have shifted, but yeah, right now, like Rotten Tomatoes has it at 84% for the critics, and I'm pretty sure that the fans are probably right around there too. And for the life of me, I cannot smell or spell potatoes. Potatoes. Oh my God. Yep. See, this is why I need Mike and Corey here just to mock me when I say shit that's stupid. All right. So 84% for critics, 76 for audience. So they're pretty close to being in line. Surprise audience, like only 76% is positive. I was expecting more than that just because it's a really good movie, but some of that could also be the controversy I talked about before. But no, it's great. What I was going to talk about that I paused for a second was about the Necronomicon, because in this one, you don't actually get the book, but instead you get recordings of this person reading the Necronomicon, or one of the books of the Necronomicon, and it ends up, which I didn't know at the time, but I learned later, it's actually Bruce Campbell's voice. So he does make a little cameo in there. It's really hard to tell it's him. Like I've listened to it 2 or 3 times since learning it's him, and I still can't tell it's him. But it's a nice little, hey, let's throw Bruce Campbell in here because he's an executive producer. But yeah, so the first one, they find the Necronomicon and they read it. That's the whole point of the first timeline, we'll call it. And then this one, it's technically, there are 3 books that we learn in Army of Darkness. There's 3 books that Ash comes across when he's in that old-timey place. So there's 3 books there, and then so the book he reads in the original is Necronomicon. Then there's this one, which when I was looking it up, it's a different book, so it's not the Necronomicon that they're listening to. And then so that leaves the ability for them to have a 3rd book. Because I think the 2013 version was them reading the Necronomicon again, and again, it's supposed to be just a retelling, just a more horror version, a more present version rather than the movies that were made in the 80s and 90s. But for this one, I think it was deliberate to be a different one, so it could be in the same universe as the Ash one, minus what had happened, obviously, in Ash vs. Evil Dead. But if you just go back to the first 2 movies and then Army of Darkness, then this one could also follow that, with just being a different book that was discovered by this secret society, or whatever you want to call them, that then these kids found in this bank vault that was in like the basement of the parking garage or whatever. So it does set up the fact that they could do a 3rd one. I don't know if you do that like in another 10 years, because these movies haven't been like cranking out right away. Obviously there was the movies in the 80s, like the first movie was 81, second movie 87, third movie 93. Then there was a 20-year gap before Evil Dead came out. And then there was Evil Dead Rise, which is 10 years later. Ash versus the Evil Dead ended in 2018, I think it was. So it's been like 5 years since then. But for the film franchises anyway, like there's quite a few years in between them. So do they do like a direct sequel? Do they wait and then we learn about this other third book? Or do they just keep that third book in their pocket, and then how do they connect? So there's a lot of things, like if you actually want to look into it, that you could be very interested with the Evil Dead franchise in general. Or you could just enjoy the horror, the gore, the thriller aspect of it, the coming into your own home and how scary that could be, the fact that your mom turns on you because obviously she's dead and possessed. So there's so many little elements that you could just enjoy for this, even if you're not an Evil Dead fan, or even if you don't want to look into the lore of Evil Dead. It's definitely worth the watch. I highly recommend it for people. It's one of those that it didn't really need to be seen in theaters, but I enjoyed seeing it in the theaters. I enjoyed seeing everything that this director had to offer, which was Lee Cronin, I believe, and I think he wrote the movie too. I know that both Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell were like executive producers, but yeah, Lee Cronin is the one that actually wrote and directed the movie, and it's such a good vision, and I'm really hoping that they do it again. Like, I really hope that Lee Cronin has another idea, can continue it, can flesh it out, but it's going to be one of those things where I wonder, do they keep trying the same type of I don't want to even call it shock value, but like this type of horror, or do they try to lean more into like the campy stuff, or do they do exactly what they did in this movie, where it was more horror, but it had some campy elements? Like, it didn't have a lot of campy elements, but it had a couple moments that I don't want to spoil for anybody that's a little bit campy. So like it had a little bit. But unlike the originals, which, it seemed to be the opposite, where it had more campy moments and some horror moments, like very few horror moments. So we'll kind of see what they do. I was more excited to talk about this with Corey and Mike, just to kind of get their take, especially Corey. Corey and I have been Evil Dead fans for years. It was one of those where we randomly started talking about it and be like, oh, you like Evil Dead? I like Evil Dead, yada, yada, yada. To the point where, like, he got me an Evil Dead figure. I got him the Evil Dead signed Bruce Campbell poster. Mike even got me an Evil Dead Necronomicon book. So, like, Evil Dead is a big thing. I don't want to call it from my childhood. That sounds so bad. Sounds like I'm sadistic. Although, but it's just one of those things that's always stuck with me. And it's mostly Bruce Campbell and his performance. But then for them to be able to keep that going in this movie. So if I'm not mostly invested because of Bruce Campbell, but that's a big part of it because of how great Ash's character is. But for them to take this franchise and do something else and give me a character I care about, I was impressed by that. And we'll kind of see what they do, where it goes. Highly recommended. I will say too, just because I want to throw out the other ones, like, so if you're gonna watch these movies, I recommend watching them in order. But if you're going to watch the movies from the 80s and then watch the movies from the 90s and the 2010s and then the series and then obviously the 2020s, obviously there's going to be a difference in quality for both the acting, for both the screenwriting, and obviously the production value of the actual movies. But if you go into them kind of knowing that to begin with, following them in chronological order is probably better. You don't necessarily need to watch the first one if you're only just trying to get caught up, because the second one, mostly due to the studio not owning the rights to the first one when they did a sequel, they kind of had to redo the first one in the first like 5 or 7 minutes of the opening of the movie, where they kind of retell it just to let everybody know where the story left off, and then you jump right into the second one. The third doesn't really have much of that, except for at the very beginning you kind of just see Ash get sucked into the portal. But I would watch them kind of like all in order, just to kind of, it's similar to like the Marvel cinematic. I'm going to watch them as they got released, even though they're not out of chronological order. And even though some are worse than others, I'm going to watch them in order because I want to experience it like if I was going to the theater to see them all. I want to get that experience, and then I might have the opinion of, that one I didn't really need to see, or that one's better than this one. I'd rather have that just as I was experiencing it in like real life, real time. For me, though, because now I'm going to wrap this up, because who likes to listen to me talk for like an hour? We'll settle for around 30 minutes. For ranking these, though, and I'm going to eliminate the TV show, but probably for me, the TV show is one of the best things, just because there's so much of it, like, and you get to know more about Ash, and it's still funny, and it has some amazing humor and gross out humor and just some actual heart to it too, which I guess I really wasn't expecting with his side characters. And Bruce Campbell is just a treasure, man. He's just a treasure. But anyway, so if we're gonna rank these movies like of all time, Army of Darkness is still number 1. But this one for me is now number 2. Evil Dead Rise is my second favorite Evil Dead movie, just because of how well they did it. But Army of Darkness, technically this is like a better production than Army of Darkness. It's a better horror movie than Army of Darkness, but Army of Darkness just leans fully into the campy, fully into the swagger of Bruce Campbell's Ash character, and it's just got so many little moments that are going to make you laugh, especially nostalgia factor of being a kid watching it and seeing like when Ash faces a bunch of tiny little Ashes. It's hilarious. But anyway, so we have the Army of Darkness, then we have Evil Dead Rise, then probably Evil Dead 1, then probably Evil Dead 2, and then the Evil Dead from 2013. Just the 2013 one it's not a bad movie. It just they tried to recreate the first one. It just didn't work the same way because they were trying to do it more in a horror element. And I guess, like, I think of the newest Doctor Strange, where I had all these high expectations of what was going to happen from last year, mostly after the Spider-Man movie, where you got to see all those cameos and everything, and you were so excited and pumped, and then you hear Multiverse of Madness, and you think of all these characters that they could bring in and how cool that's going to be, and it didn't live up to the hype. And so when I was going into the newest Evil Dead movie, from 2013, I was thinking like, okay, I know it's a reimagining. I know the girl is going to be like the main character. That's fine. I have no issues with that. But how are they going to do it? And they just leaned more into the horror because it was supposed to be the movie that like Sam Raimi kind of wanted to make the original be, rather than campy. But you kind of needed the campy. And if that's what you're looking for, then that wasn't the movie for you. But so it's probably my least favorite out of all of them because of that. This movie, I knew we weren't going to get the campy, so some of that's my knowing going in without having those expectations, and just the way they presented the movie. So yeah, I think that's how I'd rank it. I would ask these two, but those chairs are empty right now, so I'm not going to ask them. I may ask them to start the next podcast, but I don't know. I was hoping, like I said, to have the discussions with them, but they suck. Sickness and, working, who needs it? Anyway, so I'm going to wrap it up here. Evil Dead is a great franchise, has a pretty good video game out too. I recommend it for anybody that likes PvP. Well, it's like co-op versus P, where it's you and a couple other players against another player playing one of the demonic entities of Evil Dead. A lot of fun. Movies are great, TV show even better, and I can't recommend it enough. There's so many moments, there's so many lines, there's so many gifts that are just from that are just great. Next week, it'll either be all three of us back with Casey joining us, or it will be no Mike and Casey joining us, depending on if Mike is able to see the new movie, because we're going to go see Spider-Man on Saturday, and we're going to see it's Spider-Man Around the Spider-Verse. Now I've already forgotten the name of it. It is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. That's what it is. So that's going to be our next topic. So look out for that next week.